Anyway, I'll hand over to you, John, now, and welcome you hugely for this evening's talk.
Hello, and thank you, Sue. Thank you very much. Welcome. Thank you all for turning out on such a very cold evening to view a chilly church. Ha ha. So Zoom does have its advantages. We can stay by our radiators and still view a chilly church. So here we are in Rochester Row with its heavily pruned plane trees, which have a sculptural beauty of their own. I think Rochester Row looks a bit different to other streets because the trees are closely planted and they need a lot of pollarding. However, when they are pruned, one can see a bit more of St. Stephen's Church and its spire. Now, St. Stephen's sort of nestles amongst modern buildings. It's not prominent. In fact, you hardly know it's there if you're walking around until you come across it. The tower and spire, on the other hand, can be seen from quite a distance from the river or even from North London, if you get a view through. So it isn't all that conspicuous. What's more, it looks rather grey and grimy, not through neglect, but because the stone can't be cleaned. We learned that many years ago when it was surveyed for possible cleaning. The donor or the donor's architect chose some rather curious stones from Northumberland. Seems a long way to go for a London church, but they got a sandstone from Northumberland and a limestone from Northumberland. So it's a mixture of the sandstone, which can't easily be cleaned, and the limestone, which is the minority stone. And those two stones have also caused a bit of trouble over the centuries, over the years, by weathering at different paces. So there has been some undermining and some loss of pinnacles at the top of the tower. More about that spire a bit later on. And so let's proceed. Our story is a story of a building and a lady. And the lady is Angela Burdett-Coutts. And the church is her gift. A few other bodies joined in with a bit of extra money, but it was essentially her gift. She wanted it to be there. She conceived it, and she saw it through. And her philanthropy extended far, far beyond St. Stephen's, Westminster. So who was she? Who was Angela Burdett-Coutts? People know the name, but her story is really very interesting. Daughter of Sir Francis Burdett, local MP, she inherited a fortune from the Coutts' banking dynasty. So she inherited this from her grandfather's widow. She was only 23 at the time. And the fortune was considerable, and it wasn't just a lump sum, it was a share in the steady income of Coutts' bank. So she founded or funded St. Stephen's Church and the schools next door. Later in her life, she was created a baroness. She was the first woman to receive such a title. I'm looking at her now, dressed typically, I think, in the heavy laces and brocades of a mid to late Victorian lady of wealth. The red sash, in my opinion, it's the Order of the Garter, but I'm open to correction on that. And my last quote says a lot about her. "After my mother, the most significant woman in the kingdom," said Edward VII. So let's go back a bit. And some of you may know the Roke map, I'm sure you do, the Roke map of 1738. And I've circled the area that we're visiting. And I've mentioned that Vincent Square and Artillery Row are not yet developed, but they're there in sort of embryo. This, what we'll call a parade ground, morphed into Artillery Row. And this collection of what looks like market gardens, that morphed into Vincent Square. And I've guessed at the location of the future church, which is where my question mark is about there. There was, in fact, a chapel, a little chapel there, an Anglican chapel. And those of you who are gazing around the map can see some familiar names. Here is the Horse Ferry Road, which goes around the corner. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Which goes around the corner. And here's the road to the Horse Ferry. And this was then called Peter Street. And so we're Pye Street. Here we are, all the society's local little streets. Now, St. Stephen's wasn't exactly built in Devil's Acre. That's where St. Matthew's is. St. Stephen's was on the edge of it, on slightly rising ground, slightly better location, slightly healthier perhaps. And the Baroness, although she wasn't a Baroness then, Angela Burdett-Coutts, she was advised that it would be a service to the locality if a church was provided. St. Matthew's Church was provided about the same time. They're almost synchronous. Now then, I mentioned that St. Stephen's is surrounded by modern buildings, so much so that there's only one building in the locality which predates the church, as far as I can gather. And here it is on the map, it is there. And it says Greycoat School. And there it is. We know where Greycoat School is, don't we? And I've taken a photograph of the central section, the classical section with the carvings of the children in their grey coats, the charity school images, which are seen in different parts of London. In fact, there's one nearby at the Blue Coat, isn't there? So this is a much older foundation is seen on this map of 1738. On we go. So moving on to 1813, Horwood, revised by Fadden. And in my red circle, we see what has happened. Vincent Square and Artillery Row are now developed, and the site of the future church can be seen. And what's this? This is the proposed new road, and that is the line of Vauxhall Bridge Road. So everything is taking shape. The area was very much the province of the army, and there was also a police hostel there as well. So one of the references to the early days of the parish was a quote from the vicar saying, "I've got my parishioners lined up and most of them are policemen," which was quite amusing. Now, the laying of the foundation stone, the illustrated and London News reports on it. The Illustrated London News reported on most, middle and upper class functions. Now here, just like a modern newspaper, they were able to have a personality, a celebrity. And there she is, looking quite glam. It's Miss Burdett-Coutts. And her picture is more prominent than the drawing of the proposed church. And the florid journalism of the Illustrated London News speaks of the eminent bishops of London and Oxford who presided, and other dignitaries, and the laying of the foundation stone by Miss Burdett-Coutts with a silver trowel. And after the stone laying, the bigwigs were entertained to a sumptuous collation at the Greycoat School building. Now, I haven't mentioned the architect. He is not very well known, Benjamin Ferry, but he was a pupil of Pugin, and that can be seen to a modified extent inside. The spire, rising to 200 foot, can be seen from Miss Burdett-Coutts' home in Piccadilly. In fact, that was at her insistence. She wanted it to be seen from her home in Piccadilly. So it was a tall spire. Now, I mentioned that the church was accompanied by schools. They separated boys and girls. They separated little infants from the elder children. So these various buildings are school buildings and also a teacher's house. And here is the end of the church. Here is the west end of the church, just sticking into the engraving. And here are the schools and teacher's house. I'm not quite sure which is which. But what I do know is that it took a long time to develop this site, and there had been a little chapel on the site with a congregation. And so at least one of these buildings was built to house this congregation so that it wouldn't be lost during the building of the big new church. So if one of these buildings looks a bit like a little church, that would explain it. And look, there are some nice trees planted down Rochester Row. Could they possibly be the plane trees of today? Who knows? Now, this is the same corner that we've just been looking at, the west end of the church, and something different on the corner site. And a lot of you will know that this is the Westminster Kingsway College of Catering, but this wasn't built immediately after the loss of the schools. The school, incidentally, was rebuilt around the corner, much bigger. This isn't the first building to be on that site. I think some other educational building was there first. Again, I'm not going to be dogmatic about this, but this to me looks like a building from the 20s or 30s. But it could just be immediately post-war. I think this sort of decoration speaks more of the pre-war years than the post-war years. If anybody knows exactly the date of this building, that would be good. Now, around the corner, around the back, is a little street called Rochester Street. Some of you will know it well. And in Rochester Street, we have these interesting skyscapes, if you like, and three buildings, higgledy-piggledy. This one on the right is the choir vestry. That's my last note at the bottom. The choir vestry, which was tacked on in 1890. The church being completed about 1850, 1890, they needed a parish room and a choir vestry. So this was tacked on in the same style at the back. The school was rebuilt in the very late 19th century. It suffered bomb damage to the upper floor, which had to be rebuilt. And then in between is a dear little cottage, which is the school keeper's house. And again, it's very late Victorian, but it's an interesting little addition, and it gives a sort of cottagey vernacular to this area. I'm looking at an unpleasant yellow line on all these slides. I do apologize for that. I don't know where it's come from. The this foundation stone here tells us that it was laid by the Baroness in 1890. So she still kept up her interest 40 years later. If there was something important happening in the church, you called on the Baroness. Now, on the other side of Vincent Square, not on the other side of Vincent Square exactly, but at right angles to the top of Vincent Square, if you go along past the Horticultural Hall and turn the corner, you come to Vincent Street, the beginning of Vincent Street. And on the corner of Vincent Street and Hyde Place, there is Napier Hall, Hyde Place, which is tied up with the Twinings or Twinnings. Nice cup of tea family. So I'll take this slowly because it can be a little bit confusing. This is our parish hall, and beyond it is what was called the Clergy House, where clergy lived. In this block was found this board, which speaks of the life of this hall between 1904 and 1953. So over to my captions, it says that the hall was built for nearby St. Mary's Church. I mean, talk about close together, really. And not surprisingly, it became redundant and was demolished. And then it became St. Stephen's Parish Hall. So it was a bit of a land grab by St. Stephen's. There is a close link to the Twining tea business, and the board charts its history during and after World War II. Reason is the Reverend William Twining, curate and vicar for a total of 41 years until the 1920s. So this was a very important vicar, and having been a curate, so there was money available from the family to look after this lovely hall, which I think you'll agree has got some arts and crafts elements in it. And up here, very hard to see, but there is carved plasterwork in these interstices here. Rather lovely and dated also, a bit like East Anglian pargeting, unusually in London. And there is the plaque giving the dates. So I'll just take you down this board. 1904, foundation stone laid of the hall in memory of the Reverend G. Napier, vicar of St. Mary's, Vincent Square, subsequently demolished. So that's the Napier link. 1941, Twinings moved their offices into Napier Hall, having been bombed out of the Strand. You'll know that they're in the Strand to this day. 1944, Napier Hall wrecked by flying bomb. So looks as though Fritz was after the Twining family business. 1946, Twinings returned to Napier Hall. 1953, Twinings left Napier Hall, reconstructed, reopened for parish activities of St. Stephen with St. John, Westminster. Yeah. And look, one of the names here, we'll meet George Rindop, vicar, a bit later on. And one of the names here is S. Twining on treasurer. So the family was wrapped up in the church for quite a while. Back to the church building. So we're looking at the extreme west wall, the west window, not coloured, but I draw your attention to the rather lovely undercut foliage here, which is a feature of the church, quite deeply undercut carved foliage, quite discreet at the top of the, yeah. And here is Angela given the wings of an angel. And in her hands is a model of the church. So the Baroness is depicted in angelic form, bearing a carved model of the church. Her gift, her gift. So I'm sorry it's not all that clear, but although I couldn't zoom up myself, an artist zoomed up a few years ago and produced this. I'm sorry I can't hear you smiling from my end of the Zoom. So Angela as mugshot. I hope she has a sense of humor and doesn't mind me saying that. So this is what the artist recreated from that carving high up. And here is Angela as an angel donating the church. Nice touch. We're inside. We're not far from that high up carving, and we're just having a quick look at the baptismal font. Octagonal with biblical scenes and biblical references in relief around all the faces. It's a very attractive font and probably very much in line with the taste of the mid-Victorians. It once had a wooden cover. I'm sorry, the wooden cover once had a lifting mechanism, as they did in those days. And I said here, don't miss the Puginesque brass bracket on the wall behind. One of a pair, here it is, up here. It is Puginesque, isn't it? And there's one on the other side. And although I haven't got any proof of this, I think it was to hold a brass rod and some heavy curtains, because that door can be drafty. I know that. So here we are. Now we've come into through the main entrance on the north side. No, sorry, that's not correct. We have made our way to the choir stalls at the east end, and we can see one of the original rather nice carved oak pew ends here, stall ends. A vicar in the 1960s, 70s was very keen on liming the oak so that the oak no longer looked dark brown, but looked pale. Apparently liming of oak is something you do. Anyway, decades later, they're beginning to darken again. Do notice the organ, which looks sparklingly bright and colourful, which it should do because it's only a very few years old. The existing organ began to fail. We sort of sent around a search party, and a second-hand one was found. And I think I mentioned it here at the bottom. A classical note was introduced in 2012 when the original organ and case were replaced with one from a church in Leith, which dates from 1903. And the pipes were freshly painted rather gorgeously. Anybody with a very sharp eye for architectural period detail will perhaps notice that down here is the original Victorian Gothic woodwork which surrounded the existing organ, and the one from Leith is surrounded by more austere Scottish classical, no-nonsense woodwork. So it does look a bit strange having the classical woodwork superimposed on the Gothic woodwork. Don't miss these rather unusual light fittings. We'll see them again, but here they are, these light fittings, which to my mind look as if they've come out of a giant 1920s ocean-going liner, or perhaps a grand hotel on the Strand. I think we'll just move on then. Here is this pillar is merely a masking device for the steps up to the pulpit behind it, but it is a rather lovely Gothic pillar with a couple of recently added coats of arms. Now here is a very handsome insignia of the Garter. It's always been in St. Stephen's. Nobody quite knows when it arrived. Nobody quite knows who gave it. Origin unknown, but probably associated with the Baroness. Or an alternative is that it came from her great friend, the Duke of Wellington, who certainly was a member of the Order of the Garter. But it's a handsome piece, and it's a bit different to the sort of crown and coat of arms you see in Georgian churches quite often as a symbol of loyalty to the royal family. So what have I said else? That it's displayed above the clergy vestry door, incorporates the crown and royal coat of arms, and such insignia were often displayed in churches in pre-Victorian times. Now we have, as it were, come in via the north door, which is the usual way in, the north porch, and we're looking down the nave to the chancel, and we're seeing some flashes of coloured glass, which is nice. We're also seeing a few more of these 1920s transatlantic lamps, which seem to fit quite well. And I've said at the top here, this being a recent picture, there are little notices saying, sit here, don't sit here, sit here, don't sit here, sit here, but don't sit here, which is the way COVID has to regulate church attendance now. The window at the far end, the east window, is post-World War II. Its lightly tinted glass allows good light from Rochester Street behind, which is a dark, narrow street. You may have noticed these curious banners on the columns. They are provinces of Myanmar. The parish has had quite long-term links with the Anglican Church in Burma, Myanmar, which struggles to keep its presence. And if its presence is too obvious, then it gets knocked back. It's not easy being a Christian in Burma, in Myanmar. There is the window we've just been speaking of, the east window, installed post-war 1947. On a lightly tinted background are inserted the lamb and flag motif and coats of arms representing Westminster Abbey. Sorry, Diocese of London, Westminster Abbey, Diocese of Cape Town and Adelaide. paid for by the Baroness. She actually funded dioceses around the empire, paid for their churches, paid for their clergy. Not in perpetuity, but she set it up. In the middle is the lamb and flag motif, often seen in Christian iconology. And down here is the Baroness's own coat of arms. And apparently, when awarded to a lady rather than a man, it took that lozenge shape. And here is her Baroness's coronet. For a piece of work done quickly in the late 1940s, I think it's rather good. We have one side chapel, and it is called the Tenant Chapel. And this is the vicar who was here at the beginning. So dedicated in 1904 in memory of Angela Tennant, daughter of the first vicar and goddaughter of the Baroness. So it's all quite incestuous. It's a beautiful piece of work. So here we are, fin de siècle. Similar work was going on in St. Paul's Cathedral, rather lush, almost pre-Raphaelite mosaic work. And there we have Stephen and Paul, and around the corner we have Peter and Edward the Confessor, and quite a lot of highly decorated surfaces. This window looks rather heavy for a little space. That's because it is an exterior window. It was never meant to be a window for a chapel. Why? Because behind it is that choir vestry and parish room that was popped on in the 1890s. So what was an exterior window then became enclosed and interior. We're still in that chapel. Two of the mosaic panels in the chapel. Here is Stephen. And here, just gleaming through, is Edward the Confessor. The light is not falling on him. The light is coming through via the top of a corridor, which leads to the parish room around the back. Some rather pretty serpentine work there over the top. Isn't that nice? Nothing but the best was chosen for the early furnishing of St. Stephen's, and Minton tiles were the best. They were laid in the chancel. They survived the Second World War, which blew out all the windows except two. And they've come through looking pretty good. We do like our bit of Minton tiling. So, two windows came through the war because they were boarded up. Thank goodness for that. One was this one. It's our artistic treasure. The Good Shepherd window by Edward Burne-Jones, installed in 1890 in memory of the first vicar, William Tennant, and his wife. We've just met them in their little chapel. Most people think it's a fine example of the artist's mature style, and it was produced by his collaborator, William Morris and Company. So we see in the center top a robust Christ carrying a lamb, carrying a sheep. And he is surrounded by angels making music. And apparently the instruments are largely invented by Burne-Jones himself. He thought that his instruments would be more artistic than real instruments, but they have a similarity with real instruments, but they are a bit different. In recent times, an intruder smashed through the bottom of the left panel, and it was restored very, very skillfully, so nobody knows, but it was about there that he smashed through from the outside. He didn't get in. So it was a wasted effort in every way. And there are some more little angels' heads at the top. There they are, little angels' heads at the top. I think it's a wonderful piece. The colors are just right. And the figures are just right in their spacing, I think. The other window that survived the Second World War was the only one surviving from the original fittings of the church in 1850. They were made by a firm called Wales of Newcastle. I don't know how many of Wales's glass windows came to London. I had never heard of that firm before. Again, I think it's a good piece for the period. It's not overcrowded with color. It's not overcrowded with figures. We have a youthful St. Stephen in the middle. There he is with his martyr's palm and the stones that killed him. And so we have groups of figures here they are stoning him, cruelly stoning him, and other bits of his story. Thank goodness it survived. Now we're coming towards the end of our tour, and this is our grandest piece of stone carving, often overlooked because it's just behind the entrance porch. So it was made for Dr. William Brown, who wouldn't be here if it wasn't for his wife, Hannah. Hannah was Angela Burdett-Coutts's childhood governess, who then remained with her for all of Hannah Brown's life. Hannah Brown managed to get married to Dr. William Brown, and they had a life, but she was devoted to Angela, and Angela was devoted to her. So both William and Hannah Brown are buried in the chancel of St. Stephen's. I'm just gazing at the quite intricate carving. We have lambs and sheep coming into the story again. They're gazing up to heaven where William Brown has gone. And there is his portrait bust. And emblems, some of which are Masonic. We have grieving women on either side at the bottom. And then we have a text. And it's agreed widely that the text was written by Charles Dickens, who was a firm friend of the Baroness for most of their lives. In fact, Dickens was a social reformer before he began to direct Angela Burdett-Coutts in the same fields. He encouraged Angela to give her money to worthwhile causes, orphan children, abandoned women, Church of England diocese, new churches. She was very busy giving away her money to Christian causes. Now, when the Baroness died, She had always expressed a wish to be buried with Hannah and William in the chancel of the church. Hannah died, and Angela was distraught. They'd been companions since Angela's childhood. When Angela was having a hard time, she would travel. And here she was, turned 70, and she chartered a boat to sail the Mediterranean, and an assortment of people were her guests. One of whom was a young American, aged 30, charming. Not sure why he became a guest, but he was. They seemed to have a certain affinity with each other. And by the end of the voyage, she had agreed to marry him. So this young American, age 30, she was 72 or 3. They had agreed to get married. Angela was lonely, obviously. We can't speak about the young American's motives. In the event, he turned out to be an honest and respectable man, helped to look after her affairs. He was quite extravagant, but not illegally so. Angela only lived a few more years. Oh yes, and I must mention that, ironically, a clause in her inheritance stated that she was not to marry a foreigner. What did she do? She married a foreigner. She thereby lost 2/3 of her income. Well, it was a lot, but the remainder of the money was substantial too, so they weren't impoverished. She didn't stop being philanthropic, but she was less philanthropic. And so she dies. Some people knew she wanted to be buried in St. Stephen's with Hannah Brown, but the great and the good immediately claimed her for Westminster Abbey. So there was a bit of a tussle. Her husband, I suppose, had the final say. He sort of sided with the Westminster Abbey crowd, who said that space was getting very short in the Abbey, and would they mind if she was cremated so she wouldn't take up too much space. Her young husband balked at that. He did not want that. And the tussle went on. In the end, a decision over her body had to be made, and it was that she was to be somehow squeezed into a rather small pit in the Abbey floor without much ceremony. And this was done. The only comfort to her, perhaps, was that she ended up very near Lord Shaftesbury, who she knew and whose philanthropy was similar to hers. I leave you with a picture of parish life. So here is the vicar, the post-war vicar, very well-known man, became Bishop of Guildford, George Rhindorp. And he's chatting to a young parishioner in one of the drying courts of, it's either Millbank Estate or the Grosvenor Estate, Page Street. And the washing is probably getting a little bit smutty with London grime in the 1950s. but that's the period that it was taken. And speaks of the rather strange parish life of St. Stephen's, which is half the estates, Millbank and Grosvenor, and half the mansions. So it was very mixed parish in that way. I remember going back to the 1960s when the parish was really busy because it was used as a training parish and housed 6 curates and 2 Anglican nuns. And to give these curates something to do in the summer, the chief curate was expected to run a 2-week parish holiday in which we would take over a school in the country. I remember in particular taking over St. Audrey's School, Somerset. It looked for all the world like St. Trinian's. It might well have been the model for St. Trinian's. Anyway, that was a lovely mixing of parishioners from the mansion blocks and from the estates. It was really great. It was probably the best parish life aspect. But I digress. And so I've come to the end of my slideshow, and I'm quite happy to chat to anybody. I'm just moving to
Oh, thank you, John. That's absolutely super. A really intimate story and portrait. And I personally haven't really looked at Napier Hall from the exterior, so I'm certainly going to examine that. And I wonder whether our treasurer, Robert Timms, who's on the call today, will feel that in due time he might have his name along the brick wall of the Thorney Island archives, but I digress as well. I just have one question before we do some others, John, which is you showed us a mug shot,
yes.
But I wondered why the mug was created.
Yes, it was the 150th anniversary of the founding of the church, and we commissioned somebody to produce some commemorative china, and the mug was one of the commemorative pieces, and I've still got it. I use it for my morning tea. Am I coming across?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, John. I think I think Sue's muted herself now, but that was good about the mug shot. So I've just got a question about the windows and the damage in the wall. So the windows were protected, 2 windows, but only 2.
Correct.
And how much damage was there to the roof and the spire?
It was mainly blast damage. There was no direct hit, but there was quite a lot of damage all around. The school got hit. So I understand there was a lot of blast damage, the windows blown in, but not a lot of structural damage. Now, you mentioned the spire, and I would like to come back to the spire briefly.
Yes, good. There's also a question about that somebody would like to know more about the replacement spire. Yeah.
Right. That I did overlook, but I'm happy to come back to it. The spire, like I explained, the 2 sorts of stone chosen were a bit antipathetic to each other, and there was quite a lot of weathering, and the little pinnacles began to fall off the top of the tower round about the, what should we say, late 70s, 80s. And the spire was also beginning to let water in at the junction of its placing on the tower. The district surveyor noted these bits of stone falling off, and because it's so near the pavement, we were told to take down the spire. And that was a very difficult period to raise money to take something down. It's not a very appealing cause to take down an ancient part of a church. But we did it. We raised the money, we took down the spire. It was truncated, and local people will remember it being truncated for a long time. And then eventually, partly because of technology, it was decided that a steel and fiberglass replica could be made. And I remember clearly this arriving by long truck in 2 pieces and being lowered into Rochester Row, which was closed off for the day, and very heavy machinery lifting it in 2 sections up on top of the tower. It looks all right. It was made to match in color. It looks pretty authentic, but it's never been a perfect fit. We have had trouble with water ingress at the base of the fiberglass spire.
Okay, thank you. Louise is asking, where in Piccadilly did Baroness Burdett-Coutts live?
I do not know.
Do we know? No.
Somebody might.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
And also Gordon asks, do you know, does anyone have the text of the Dickens epitaph?
It's easily read. Just pop into church and read it.
Yeah.
I haven't got it myself. I could go and copy it down and sort of broadcast it or send it to somebody.
Yes, we send a follow-up of any further notes, so that we'll get that off you. That would be good. I just wanted to ask Victor. Victor, you're a bit of a Dickens fan. Did you know about that on your doorstep?
No, I didn't know about it on my doorstep, and I should be in there very shortly to figure it out.
I can recommend.
I've got to go, unfortunately, in a second. I was going to ask, did you say that it was the head office of Twinings for a while, Napier?
Seems like it was.
Goodness, right.
Like it was when the Strand premises were bombed. They moved to Napier, and then Napier was bombed, and they had to move back there.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much. I
Victor,
know that's brilliant.
Victor,
Sorry?
when you visit, could you visit on a Wednesday lunchtime? You'll find the church open.
Right, that's probably better than going there when it's closed. Thank you for that.
I mean, Sunday is fine, but it happens to be open from about 11 till 2 on Wednesdays.
On Wednesdays, I'll put it in my diary now.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Bye.
I've got another question here from Chris. He thinks that most of the catering school is 1950 to 1955 by Goodhart Rendell, who also did St. Olaf House in Tooley Street late in his career, so looking older.
Thanks. That is very helpful. That's very interesting. So 1950s by a good architect. Yes. Thanks.
Okay. Do we know how long it took to build the church and how much it cost?
I could ferret that out. Let's just say that it was pricey. The materials and the fittings were of high quality. The stone, as I say, came from Northumberland. That couldn't have been a cheap journey. I know they had some problems with settlement because, like so much in the Thorney Island zone, we are building on mud, basically, aren't we? We're building on swamp. And St. Stephen's was no exception, although on slightly higher ground. And they had to doubly reinforce under the tower and spire. It's as well that they did, because there's quite enough trouble coming up with that as well. I can't give you the figure. I think it was probably a little bit more than most of the other neighbouring Victorian churches. But that didn't really worry Angela.
No, good foundations. Why are Minton tiles so famous?
Good question. I think it was partly very high quality manufacture in the encaustic technique, and partly the best design, the best designers and the best quality. I think the Victorians had quite a good nose for that sort of thing, and they knew what was best.
Yeah, lovely. They certainly do look fabulous. Well, because I'm out of London, I am so dying to go back and visit, and now lots more information about St. Stephen's. Would anybody else like to ask a question? Anne Parker said something about Stratton Street, but I'm not quite sure what she's referring to.
She lived in 1 Stratton Street.
Oh, thank you, Anne.
That's the Baroness.
Did she? Got it.
Thank you.
In Mayfair, yeah. Number 1.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Of course. I really like the idea that she could see the spire from her Mayfair home. Okay.
I just got one more question, John, which, do you think there's a link between Northumbria and which you mentioned, and that the Wales of Newcastle made that wonderful window, and the stone you said, which unusually came from Northumberland?
Yeah, that did occur to me actually, that is it a coincidence that there's a strong northern link? I don't think it's the Baroness, whether it was the architect who had a link up there. It looks like somebody did, doesn't it? Because that's a long way to go for stained glass as well, right? A bit more fresh research, yeah.
Well, I think it's not just you, John, who's going to wants to do a little bit more research, but I think certainly so many of us do as well, especially Anne Parker there, who immediately came up with something to answer a question about where she actually lived, which was really interesting. So if there are no more questions, can I thank John hugely on our behalf, and we'll be sending out an email following this talk with the video of this evening recording, and we will include also the quote by Charles Dickens, which John is going to research for us.
I'll get that as soon as possible. I can't promise to get it within a week, but I may get it within a couple of weeks.
Fine. Oh, well, yeah, okay, so we might do a 2-staged reply, but thanks very much.
I think Victor's going around there tomorrow, isn't he?
I suspect he will, yes.
He's a journalist.
Yeah, he may preempt me and supply it.
He might.
Yes. Let me know if he does.
Will do. Thanks ever so much, John. And may I just give you another date for your diary, which is on Tuesday, the 27th of April is our next talk, when the historian and author Dr. Elizabeth Biggs is talking about rediscovering the medieval Palace of Westminster. So that's something to look forward to in a few weeks' time. But John, it's been absolutely fabulous because it's a very intimate portrait of a place where you have worshipped for over 50 years. And it's historical and ecclesiastical journey. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. I really appreciate being asked. Thank you.